Today, we are shining a spotlight on three elephants in the room. In the last video, I talked a bit about the documentary hypothesis and mentioned that we would be discussing three elephants in the room regarding the evidence for the Exodus. If you like these videos and wish to help out, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps us. And if you wish to support us financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member. Okay, in the last video, I mentioned that I reject the documentary hypothesis and that I generally take the biblical text on its merits, unless I have a compelling reason to do so. For example, if the bulk of textual evidence is against a certain reading. But that's more finding what the original autographs would have said. So, therefore, I tend to ascribe Mosaic authorship to the bulk of the Pentateuch. And I take a textual approach that tries to treat the Bible like any other ancient Near Eastern text. Having said that, though, as we get into the topic of the evidence for the Exodus, I need to lay down a few more ground rules. One of those ground rules is that there are a lot, and I mean a lot, of different views on the Exodus. And these views can range from, say, Aardsma's ultra-low Exodus to Friedman's Levite Exodus theory. And I'm not going to address those theories in this series. And that's because if I start going into those alternate views, we won't get to the good stuff, which is the actual evidence. Besides, I have other videos that will discuss some of those views, and if you wish, you can reference the card above and watch those videos. But today, I am going to focus on sort of the three elephants in the room. When we talk about the evidence for the Exodus, we have to sort of engage these elephants because they're big, they're in the room, and they make their presence known. And the first elephant is hermeneutics. Now, almost every discussion of the Exodus is prefaced by this elephant in the room. So we might as well just get it over with. I have discussed this before, and if you want to see the issue in detail, again, there's another card up in the corner that you can reference to see a whole series on this issue. But we do need to discuss it in a sort of broad sense. Now, hermeneutics is the art of interpreting a text, any text, biblical or otherwise. So when we broach the Exodus, a conflict in hermeneutics immediately arises. And the issue here is two conflicting readings of Scripture. 1 Kings 6:1 says that Solomon built his temple in the 480th year of the Exodus. And Exodus 1:11 says that the Israelites built the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses. The conflict is that you cannot read both these verses in a wooden literal manner at the same time. However, if you want to say anything meaningful about the Exodus at all, you are forced to choose which set of verses you decide to read literally. And as much as one may insist that one must read all these verses literally, in practice, that does not simply work out. For those who have seen my previous videos, the problem is that a wooden literal reading of 1 Kings 6:1 implies a 15th century BC date, while a literal reading of Exodus 1:11 infers a 13th century BC date. Honest exegetes recognize this tension, and that there is really no way to escape it. Less than honest exegetes insist that they're reading both texts literally at the same time, when they don't and can't. I've never met one of these less than honest exegetes who, when pressed, didn't try to prevaricate or just tried to avoid answering the question altogether. So we're faced with a dilemma. If you want to say something meaningful about the Exodus, you are forced to take a side on this interpretive issue. For me, I took the position that overall does the least damage to the biblical text. The Exodus is not an event in isolation. It is an event that sits in the midst of other events. It has a context within Egyptian and biblical history, archaeology, and culture. It has to be reconciled with other narratives in the Bible, such as the Joseph narrative and the conquest narrative. And all these contextualized events must be considered when we weigh our exegetical choices. The other consideration comes from the book of Exodus itself. If we were just to consider the book of Exodus without any other text weighing in, the context infers a 13th century date by its culture, by its geography, by the names being mentioned. All of that implies a 13th century context. Now, I accept that we have to take Scripture in its totality, but we also can't forsake the immediate context of the specific writings of Scripture itself. So, if a large text of Scripture gives us one context, it is poor methodology to take a single verse from a later Scripture which would infer a different context, and that later reading should supersede the original. We should at least first consider that our interpretation might be mistaken. To do otherwise is just hermeneutic crazy talk. So, overall, the text of the book of Exodus presents a 13th century Ramesside context. And to accept a 15th century BC Exodus presents too many problems for me to accept it as viable. Furthermore, sufficient evidence exists from the ancient Near Eastern context to show that the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1 could be a figure that is not intended to be an exact count. Thus, because of the Exodus, I'm forced to accept a literal reading of Exodus 1:11. The second elephant in the room is chronology. Now, many views of the Exodus come with their own chronology. These chronologies often ignore scholarly best practices, preferring to hype up doubt over error. Okay, so what is the difference between doubt and error? Let me give you an example, an illustration. We have two shooters and we take them out to a rifle range. Now, one shooter is a U.S. Marine expert sharpshooter. We give him a highly machined rifle with a calibrated scope. And he puts in his target a dot of shots that are about 3 inches across. Now, there are errors in the manufacturing of the rifling and the gun. There's some error in the manufacturing of the scope, and combined, that error leads to a deviation of 3 inches on the target. That is error. Now we take that same rifle and we give it to a drunken teenager. It's doubtful that that teenager is even going to hit the target, let alone produce a nice, neat circle of shots. That's the difference between doubt and error. The error doesn't play any factor in the teenager's ability to not hit the target, or inability to hit the target. There's another factor here that has nothing to do with the rifle itself. So when we talk about chronology and the best practices of chronology, good professional practices have some deviation because of error. But these alternate chronologies aren't relying on error. They're relying on doubt. And that's a whole different matter. Modern chronology is based upon hundreds of data points. So an error of 10 or 20 years might be possible. But of a century or more? No, that's not likely, given the data points that we have. To suggest otherwise is to invoke the doubt of a drunken teenager, not of sound professional practices. So when we talk about dates and chronology as we explore the Exodus, we are just going to use a conventional low chronology, because that's the one that's most likely to be true and most likely to be accurate in this case. Okay, the third elephant in the room is historical evidence. We need to discuss the standards of historical evidence. When we deal with ancient history, we cannot use the same evidentiary standards that would be used for, say, modern or early modern history, or by early modern historians. Modern and early modern historians depend upon what's called direct evidence. Evidence that directly shows that an event happened. And so we often get the remark that there is no evidence for the Exodus. Now, some of the basis for this remark comes from a different evidentiary standard than what is normally used for ancient history. Ancient history is often constructed using evidence of consistency, also called indirect evidence. For example, we have no direct evidence for the invasion of the Sea Peoples during the reign of Ramses III. What we have is Ramses III's account that the Sea People invasions took place. It's a testimony. It's a third-person account of what happened. Now, it just so happens that this account fits with the context of the period. In essence, an account from an ancient source tells us that something happened, and we ask the question, is the account consistent with what we know from the other evidence? If the other evidence tells us that a source might be correct, that is indirect evidence. With indirect evidence, you build an inductive case, which is perfectly valid if you have enough evidence. Most of the evidence used in the practice of ancient history leans more towards indirect evidence over direct evidence. So then it should not surprise us if most of the evidence for the Exodus is indirect evidence, not direct evidence. So, That covers the groundwork for exploring the topic of evidence for the Exodus. The remaining episodes of this series will explore specific topics as they relate directly to the Exodus itself. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting and informative. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.